clerical clerk in law. And that experience was me writing my first letter of advice for a client. So I was writing a letter of legal advice for a client, and I sweated blood, sweat and tears over this this piece of drafting. And I thought, look, I'm feeling pretty confident about what I've done here. I've studied law at university. I think I know what I'm doing. And so I gave my draft to my supervising partner, who returned it with a sea of red pen all over it, to the point where I could barely even see what it was that I had actually produced in the first place. And that was deeply, deeply traumatizing for me, because I really felt like I should know how to do this. I should know how to do this. And why am I getting all of this feedback and all of this, scrawl all over my draft? What's wrong with me? And that process of getting that first kind of really voluminous feedback from my partner has kind of sent me on a journey, really thinking about how important it is for us to have a constructive relationship to feedback. So I started out in law, and I had to get used to getting feedback very, very quickly, because that was the nature of that profession. I was constantly writing and constantly receiving feedback. And if I, lost my cool every time I got feedback, I wasn't going to get very far. After I finished in the legal profession, I went and studied music, and I studied performing as a jazz singer. And that brought with it a whole new range of challenges in terms of feedback. Artists and performing artists are constantly getting feedback from a wide variety of people. It might be your teacher. It could be your fellow students. It could be the audience members. It could be other musicians. You're kind of getting this information about your performance constantly from all of these different places. And singers in particular find this a little bit challenging, because we often equate anything to do with any feedback to do with our singing as something that is quite personal. So that's a whole different challenge. And after a performing career, I found myself in academia. And boy, I think this is the greatest challenge of all, in terms of the feedback that one receives in academia, and really trying to cultivate a constructive and positive attitude towards that. So if you're a PhD student, obviously you're constantly writing, drafting, you're giving those drafts to your supervisors, and you're awaiting their feedback on your work. If you're an academic working in an institution and you're teaching, you're going to be getting feedback from students. You're going to be getting feedback from other colleagues about your work. You're going to be submitting articles for peer review, and you're getting feedback on that. You might be submitting grant applications. So in academia in particular, we are really getting feedback constantly about our performance. And some of that feedback is for things that are really quite high stakes. A grant application, for example, could mean the difference between having a job or no job. So academia in particular, I think, is a very challenging environment, because of the amount and the type of feedback that we are constantly having to process. So that's just a bit of background about the type of work that I've done throughout my working life, and the types of feedback that I've had to kind of come to terms with. And that's why I really am quite passionate about this topic. So today, this presentation, I just want to set some expectations, I guess, for what this presentation is going to be. This presentation is an overview of my experiences, my learning around feedback, and it's really coming from the perspective of a recovering perfectionist. I'm somebody who had really unreasonable expectations of myself, and that's something that I struggle with still, but I think I have learned a lot throughout the last few decades of working, and I certainly am nowhere near as perfectionistic as I used to be. So I find, again, in academia, we attract high achievers. We attract people who have done very well for themselves in their field, and we can often tend towards perfectionism. So I'm coming from that perspective. I understand what that's like. This presentation is also an overview of the things that I've learned from doing a lot of reading about feedback, about leadership, and about personal growth. The presentation is not based on any research or any kind of academic literature around feedback per se. I'm talking about a sample size of 1, and that's me. But a lot of the presentations that we've had so far in the AMP series have really, our presenters have drawn on their own personal experiences, and I've actually really valued that type of information. So I hope you find something of value out of my experience too. And I'm not suggesting that these strategies are universally helpful or useful, but they have helped me. And so I hope that you find something of use, even if it's just one small thing that you can take away from today and put it into practice. So before we leap right into the nitty-gritty, my definition of feedback is very simple, and it is information. It's information on performance. That's it. And by today's session, I hope that I've convinced you that there will always be some valuable information in the feedback that you receive. So the ideas that I'm going to present to you today and the strategies are designed to minimize the shock of feedback that we can sometimes feel, and to better prepare you to be open to feedback and to help you feel empowered when you're implementing your feedback. Okay, so that's where we're headed today. Let me just move on. So what we're going to cover is in 3 short sections. The first one is preparing for feedback, getting ourselves into the right mindset and the right frame of mind to receive the feedback. Receiving the feedback is our second section. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about how we action our feedback. And in each section, I'm giving you practical strategies to increase your understanding of how you personally relate to feedback. So let's dive straight into preparing to receive feedback. Now, I don't know about you, but in the past, when I've known that I've got feedback coming down the pipeline, I can sometimes get quite anxious about that. I can, become very tense, and I may slip into that fight or flight mode where I'm really kind of gearing up for a bit of a battle. So my first practical tip here for today is I'm really encouraging you to cultivate an awareness of what you are like in the lead up to receiving feedback. What happens in your body? Do you find yourself getting tense? In terms of your thinking, do you find that you start to engage in catastrophic thinking where you're thinking, my supervisor's going to hate everything that I've done. They're going to absolutely trash my work. I don't know how I'm going to recover from this, and nothing has even happened yet, right? In terms of your emotions, do you find that you're getting, really fearful about what's coming down the pipeline? If you fall into these kind of, if you relate to those types of feelings and thoughts in the lead up to feedback, my tip to you is to cultivate your mindset. So what I would encourage you to do is when you become in touch with your kind of habitual reaction to feedback, if it is kind of negative and not that constructive, think about trying to flip that script. And there is a number of ways that we can do that. And I've personally used these and found them to be really, really helpful. So I consider feedback, I consider preparing, receiving, and actioning feedback to actually be an act of personal leadership. So what do I mean by that? Usually we think about leadership as leading others in an official kind of leadership capacity or a leadership role. But leadership is also leadership of the self. Now, I define leadership as looking for the potential in other people and bringing them along with you. And in terms of preparing yourself for feedback, you have to be your own leader. You have to get yourself into the mindset that you want to reach your fullest potential, and you are going to be open to the information that's coming to you so that you can learn and improve. And This next slide shows you a little heuristic that I have found to be extremely helpful in this regard. It comes from the 15 Commitments to Conscious Leadership, which is a fantastic book about leadership, but it's really a fantastic book about how to live in a more conscious way rather than just going through life with our own usual habitual reactions to things. So this heuristic helps us to cultivate an awareness of our state of mind at any given time. And it's particularly useful, I find, when we're heading into stressful situations, such as receiving high stakes feedback, right? So it's quite similar in concept, I think, to Carol Dweck's theory of the fixed or the growth mindset. So if you're not familiar with Carol Dweck's work, she has a theory around learning, whereby if you have a fixed mindset, you believe that intelligence is innate and that it can't be developed throughout life. This is simplifying things quite a bit. And then the kind of opposite of that is having a growth mindset, where you believe that with the right guidance and effort, you can always learn something. So this heuristic, which is above and below the line thinking, is quite similar to that idea of a fixed and growth mindset. When we're located below the line, and there is no real line, it's just an imaginary thing. When we're located below the line, we have a scarcity mindset. There isn't enough of anything to go around. It's characterized by a belief that the world is full of threats. And when we're below the line, we have a very serious, somewhat negative outlook. We cling to our opinions, we find fault and blame with others, we gossip, we over-explain, we rationalize and justify. We either avoid conflict or pursue it for the sake of winning. So ultimately, if we're below the line, we are committed to being right, and we are going to stick to our guns no matter what, okay? On the other hand, when we can be above the line, learning and growth are more important than being right. So it's a belief that all people and circumstances exist for our own personal growth. It's characterized by curiosity, deep listening, constant examining and questioning of one's own beliefs. Above the line thinking is being playful and not overly serious. So I'd like to encourage you to shift yourself to above the line thinking when you're preparing to receive feedback, if you're finding yourself falling into that negative mindset. If I'm below the line, am I really aligned with my personal values? This is another question to ask. You know, if you're feeling really stressed about the feedback that's coming to you, and you have a personal value of learning, are you really being fully committed to your personal values by getting into a state about, you know, having to defend yourself in the face of feedback? So I'm going to keep saying this all the time, that feedback is information and it helps us to learn. And these are really important things to keep front of mind. So let's just pause for a minute, because I've been talking quite a bit, and let's think about where you tend to fall yourself in the face of receiving feedback. Do you tend to be below the line? Do you tend to be concerned and anxious and closed and defensive? Or are you usually above the line and you're actually open and curious and committed to learning? So my first tip is cultivate an awareness of that in that kind of preparation phase, waiting for the feedback to come to you. All right, I have a bonus tip for everybody here in terms of preparing for feedback. And this is one that I have learnt from being a music practitioner and a creative artist. And it comes from the work of Liz Lerman, who's an American choreographer, amazing lady. I actually had the chance to work with Liz Lerman back in 2013 when she came out here and taught the critical response process, which is where this tip comes from. So the critical response process is all about giving and receiving feedback that motivates people to want to improve and to want to learn and to want to work harder. So we want our feedback to be motivating rather than deflating. Okay. So my tip to you is, wherever possible and appropriate, you take control of the feedback process. So what might this look like? For HDR students, I would highly encourage you to go into your supervision meetings with a feedback agenda. Be specific about the type of feedback that you want from your supervisor. They'll love you for it, okay? If you've been really working hard on something like paragraph structure, for example, go into your supervision meeting and say, this is the thing that I've been really working on, paragraph structure. I would like you to focus your feedback today on that. Okay, so it really kind of gives a direction for the feedback giver, and it really helps you to get the feedback that you're actually specifically interested in and the things that you're working on. So set a feedback agenda. That also includes saying things like, you know what, I know I really have to work on the structure of the literature review. I'm working on that in the background, and when I'm ready to get feedback from you on that, I'll let you know. So you can kind of dictate in a way what's in and what's out in terms of feedback. So I think a lot of students don't realize that that's an option for them, is to actually set the agenda for their own feedback. So that's something to consider when preparing for feedback, okay? All right. This is section 2, and this is receiving feedback. We're sitting in the office with our supervisors, and we've just received some really important feedback on the final draft of our PhD thesis or something like that, you know. We might be reading through reviewers' reports for an article that we've written. My tips here are, first of all, to put yourself in the shoes of the person giving the feedback. What do most people who are giving feedback want for you? They want to help you. That's what they want, okay? They want to help you, and they want to give you information to improve your work. 99% of people fall into that category. Okay, I'm not going to be so Pollyanna to kind of say that there aren't people out there who don't have good intentions. That's true, but it's very, very rare in my experience. Most people want to give information that's going to help you. I performed at a masterclass once for James Morrison, who's a famous Australian jazz trumpet player, and we were talking about performance anxiety, and something that he said to me that day actually really stuck with me, and that is, just remember, the audience is always on your side. The audience wants you to succeed. They want you to do a great show. They want you to do a great performance. And it's the same with people who are giving you feedback, okay? And I think that really helps to kind of keep things in perspective. The person giving you feedback is trying to help in almost every case. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of a practical tip for receiving feedback is probably more relevant when you're receiving verbal feedback. And my tip is this: I want you to practice close and active listening without reacting. So oftentimes when we're in a meeting and we might be getting feedback on our work from a colleague or a supervisor, they'll say something about our work, and then we'll want to jump in straight away and explain it or defend it, okay? I see this happen all the time, and, you know, I have to stop myself from doing it. It's just a natural human tendency to want to get in there and kind of explain yourself. But what I'd encourage you to do is to actually listen very closely to what that person is telling you, take notes, and really resist the urge to kind of jump in and interrupt. I think we tend to fall into you know, a defensive mode when someone's speaking to us about our work, and this actually stops the flow of information. All right, the person giving the feedback might then lose their train of thought. They might not complete the sentence that they're giving you. So you're actually going to miss out on really valuable information. So if you can keep quiet as much as possible and take notes and just listen, you're going to get a lot more out of that situation. Now, sometimes despite our best efforts and despite the best intentions of the feedback giver, we can feel hurt by feedback. Now, if this happens to you during a supervisory session, for example, You may need to take some time to allow those feelings to kind of pass through you and for you to process those feelings. And it's best to take the time to do this away from the immediate situation. So, for example, you get a lot of information and you're feeling really overwhelmed by it. My advice would be to say, thank you so much for that information. I've taken notes. I'm going to need to go away and have a really good think about this. And I'm going to need to take some time to process it. What that does is make sure that you don't have an emotional reaction to the feedback in the moment, because again, that kind of derails the whole process. So it really does take time to process those emotions before you can fully process the information. Now, I'm just trying to find my train of thought here. Yes, process the emotion before processing the information. I think that's really, really important. If we're in that kind of emotional state, we're not going to be fully comprehending the information that's being given to us. It's really common, I think, for our initial reaction to feedback to be, oh, that's just wrong. Oh no, they don't understand what I'm trying to say. You know, you might think that they've just completely missed the point, whatever. It's very easy for us to see the wrongness, the supposed wrongness in feedback. However, the problem with getting caught up in the supposed wrongness of it is that it's going to prevent you from learning. Now, what I mean by that is that even if you think the person has, say, completely missed the point of what you've tried to say, there's information in that, okay? It's not their fault that they don't understand what you're trying to say. You need to really think about that, and you need to think, maybe I haven't actually explained this as clearly as I thought I had, okay? Maybe I do need to have more detail so that someone in their position can understand what I'm saying. So always be thinking, what is it about what this person's trying to tell me that is trying to help me improve my work? Here's a little saying that I came across a few weeks ago when I was doing some research for this talk, which I really like, and it's a little strategy to deal with our emotional responses to feedback. If you're furious, get curious. So what is it in the feedback that is triggering your anger or your kind of, negative response? That's a sign that you need to get curious. Dig deeper, really try to find what the true information is in that feedback. And if you're in a situation where you can ask questions, say, tell me more. I need more information. I really want to unpack what it is about what you didn't understand so that I can actually address that. So, you know, tell me more. Give me more information. I'd like to hear more about that particular thing that you've told me. These are all ways that we can get curious rather than feel furious. Okay, so we're on to the third section, and that is actioning our feedback. So we've prepared ourselves, we're above the line, we're open to learning, we've got the information from the person who's providing the feedback. What do we do? I'm not going to go into the mechanics of how to action detailed feedback because that's really not the point of today's talk. Today I'm really focusing, I guess, more on the mental side of things and the emotional side of things. I think the most important thing to remember in this particular phase where you're ready to actually, you know, sit down and go through the information and try to implement it in your work, the most important thing to remember is that you have agency in this whole process. So I hope this doesn't contradict everything that I've just said, but I think it's really important to remember that ultimately it is your work. And you don't have to action feedback if you don't think it is going to improve your work. If you have a genuine counter argument as to why you don't want to action the feedback, then explain it and say so. So this is something that I've learned really through peer review of journal articles. The first couple of articles I wrote, I felt that I had to respond to every single thing that the reviewers said. And even when it kind of meant that reviewers were contradicting themselves, I somehow had to find a way to resolve that and make it work so that I kept everybody happy. And I wasn't really thinking, does this actually improve my work or not? So I think that's a really important thing to have top of mind when you're implementing feedback. Is this going to improve my work? Am I happy with the way that this is going to improve my work? Yep, I'm going to action it. But you do ultimately have that choice. My advice is to pick your battles in that respect, though. So, you know, mostly you're going to action feedback because almost always it's going to improve your work. Try to really pick the battles where you're going to stand up for yourself and say, no, I'm not going to implement that. Okay, don't waste time and energy on too many battles and too many no's. All right. If you feel yourself falling below the line and being defensive about every little thing when you're actioning the feedback, you really need to sit with that and think about what's going on within yourself. Monitor yourself all the time for feelings of defensiveness and whether you're, you know, kind of slipping there. So the feedback process isn't just isolated to moments of receiving feedback. It's a part of a much larger project. And that larger project is really developing ourselves as lifelong learners and lifelong generators of new knowledge as researchers. And that larger project of, you know, making sure that we realize our fullest potential. So in summary, we talked about preparing for feedback. I encouraged you to cultivate an awareness of your habitual reactions in the lead up to feedback. I encouraged you to practice above the line thinking, to be curious and open to learning. And I suggested that you can actually set an agenda for feedback in certain situations. In the second section, when you're receiving feedback, just remember that reviewers and people giving you feedback, they really want the best for you. Practice active listening rather than reacting when you're receiving verbal feedback. If you are reacting, make sure that you take time out to process the emotion before processing the actual feedback. And then finally, in terms of actioning feedback, remember that you have agency in this whole process, that you get to make the final call about what feedback gets implemented and what doesn't, and constantly monitor your emotions and always be working to move above the line. I've got a few resources here that I would highly recommend to everybody. So the first one is that book where the below the line thinking comes from, and that's the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. It's a really great book, some great ideas there for kind of leading yourself as a researcher and leading yourself to realize your fullest potential by taking on as much information as you can that others give you. There's a link to a video which explains above and below the line thinking. There's the book, The Critical Response Process, which I mentioned. And then I've also got a couple of links to some really great resources. The first one is How to Disagree with Reviewers with Examples. It's fantastic. And then How to Handle Tricky Peer Reviewer Comments. And that's a downloadable handbook. And they've both got really good detailed examples in them. And I'll make sure that there are links to those on the AMP's website where all of these resources and a recording of today's presentation will be housed. So that's it for me. I'm not going to speak at you anymore. I want to speak with you. So thanks very much for being here today. I do tend to spend a lot of time on Twitter, way too much time. So there's my Twitter handle, and I'd love to see people follow me on Twitter, and I'll follow you back. I find that there are just some really great conversations happening on Twitter around research, particularly for ECRs. So come and join in the conversation on Twitter. And yeah, looking forward to hearing your thoughts on all of this and having a chat with you. So thank you very much. And if we can